With deepest sympathies, the visual language of grief. What do you think about when you think about grief? Bereavement specifically. Of course, we grieve at many times in our lives. We mourn a painful breakup, we're torn apart by an unexpected redundancy from a much loved job. But death, like no other form of grief, has sprung up an industry and an aesthetic which pervades all of our experiences as we navigate our way through the difficult days and weeks following a loved one's death. Of course, it had to be this way. Unlike other forms of grief, death brings with it immediate practical arrangements which must be made, and over the entire existence of humanity, an industry has sprung up to meet these needs. Many of the cliched visual tropes which we see throughout mourning materials in the Western world today have their origins in practical needs. Though today their role is purely symbolic, flowers were traditionally used to mask the smell of death. Wearing black to funerals dates back as far as the Roman Empire, though possibly reached its peak during the Victorian era, when mourning widows would wear black for as long as a year after their husband's death. Religion, in Western cultures generally Abrahamic religion, also plays a heavy role in even secular funeral materials. Clouds are a soothingly neutral visual backdrop, but of course ultimately reference the hoped-for heavenly destiny of the deceased. Imagery of white doves, and even releasing a dove, a practice which is appallingly cruel to the doves concerned, is often associated with release and freedom, but of course has its origins in the story of Noah in the Old Testament. There are also some more contemporary visual metaphors which are frequently seen in grief-related materials. There are examples of seed heads in mourning cards. The cycle of flowers dying to reveal seed heads containing new life can be a comforting way of thinking about a person's passing. Another commonly seen concept when searching for grief-related stock imagery or cards is the ocean, or more specifically a person looking out at the ocean. It's harder to find the exact origins of this metaphor, but many of us will be familiar with the ocean as a good place to grapple with big emotions, being reminded of our own smallness. But lots of these ideas, which were rooted in practical cause or religious ceremony, have become little more than polite, traditional, tired repetition. They all share in common an impersonal touch at what arguably should be one of the most personal moments, the memory of a person's entire life, hopefully richly, elaborately, and individually lived. Let's look over the ocean as our stock image mourner does so wistfully to see what different approaches other cultures take. Perhaps a culture with one of the most iconic death traditions is Mexico. Mexican funeral and death practices are rooted in both Catholicism and Aztec and Mayan traditions. While many aspects of a Mexican funeral would be familiar to Westerners, the bold colours of surrounding materials and loud atmosphere feel quite at odds with our more austere, staid aesthetics. Flex Mami created this insightful and in-depth series of Instagram stories about Ghanaian funeral culture, highlighting again the contrast to, as she puts it, the global West's very bland way of celebrating someone's passing. Japanese aesthetics around death and mourning on the surface appear largely similar to our own, with a lot of neutral, subtle design choices, though of course with some elements that are less familiar to us. What Japanese funerals really emphasize is the importance of ritual, which extends across cultures, though is taken to extremes in Japan. Japanese funerals are complex and incredibly specific in their routines and traditions, and the carrying out of these rituals brings comfort to many who mourn, though Japan also embraces very modern technology in some aspects of its death industry. While Western traditions have less complex and strict rules, it's nonetheless a great comfort for many to experience death through a very particular and traditional lens. So it seems that for some people tradition is comfort and ritual is a balm, but for others tradition and ritual are sometimes painful routines, and the current mainstream visual aesthetics of grief are impersonal and hold little warmth or comfort. Of course, it's impossible to make sweeping generalizations when it comes to something as personal as the loss of a loved one, but it does seem like the divide often falls on age lines. Younger generations find many of the visual tropes and traditions of grieving materials, which have remained largely unchanged for the last century, to be impersonal, generic, and unhelpful to them as they process grief, particularly unexpected grief. It's possible to see some shifts in funeral design when sadly a younger person is lost. Of course, if a young person dies today, they have so many more pictures of their life and experiences. At younger people's funerals, we much more often are printing multiple big A2 photo boards with montages of images. These kinds of montages both offer a very different aesthetic to the more staid aesthetics of many funerals, and a much more personal experience of memorial. While there have historically been small nods to an individual's preferences, for example their name in flowers the colours of their favourite football team, a combination of advances in both environmental awareness, printing technology, and cultural acceptance of less traditional aesthetics have led to a new industry of thick cardboard printed coffins, with designs representing a person's life and interests, some of which even inject a rare sense of humour into proceedings. As seen in Ghana, where personalised coffins have long been part of funeral tradition, these reflect the interests and passions of the deceased in a much louder way than we've commonly seen before in Western funeral culture. Can we see similar trends in other designed ephemera we might encounter at this time? One of the most prominent examples, and the example which inspired this entire analysis, is greetings cards. How do some of the UK's biggest greeting cards companies tackle this sensitive area? Of all the companies I researched, Moonpig were the most interesting, and their website had two separate sections, one titled Sympathy, which was home to very traditional cards, and another titled Empathy, which was home to much more contemporary designs with much more informal contemporary language. Neither category contains cards whose messages are exclusively empathetic or sympathetic, but the empathy category is obviously designed to target a younger generation. One major shift is in the tone of language used. These cards attempt to convey sentiments we might express in informal settings, such as, I don't really know what to say, and this really sucks, I'm so sorry. Expressing things in these terms in printed form was unheard of until comparatively recently. Of course, this change in tone of language needs to be accompanied by a change in design to match. As pictured opposite, these contemporary messages no longer fit the dated style of traditional mourning materials. Many of the more contemporary cards have very limited imagery, using only bold typography to convey a relatable, colloquial, informal and personal message, or at least as personal as a pre-printed card can be. The advantage that online retailers like Moonpig have is the ability to stock more options, so that hopefully almost anyone can find a phrasing that feels like something they would actually say. But for many people, none of the cards specifically designed to convey these sentiments feel right. The traditional symbolism is too impersonal, and the language of whatever style is either dated and doesn't feel like something they would say, or is in words which would be better directly written. These handwritten words are then perhaps best accompanied by unrelated to grief imagery, which has more meaning for both the sender and the receiver. Perhaps in both funeral settings and the surrounding days, the time has come where dated grief-specific tropes and clichés are being resigned to the past. We are slowly building new rituals which focus on imagery, phrasing and visuals with much more personal meaning for the deceased and the bereaved. Thanks to new technologies of production and distribution, it is possible to embrace this customization fully. We tread sensitive ground between reverence and irreverence in this area, but ultimately the desire for remembrance and tribute will shine through. So my visual essay is a printed piece, and it's definitely done the most justice in its printed form. So the video presentation was based on a PDF. I've got a little bit of writing here covering the other points, so I'm going to just kind of try and show you the printed piece a little while I read my words, so this might be a little haphazard. So my visual essay is called The Visual Language of Grief, and my goals were to investigate current Western aesthetics of bereavement and mourning ephemera, and to consider whether they are fit for contemporary purpose. I conducted extensive historic research and research into other cultures' practices. Once I'd established a broad contextual basis for my essay, I focused in on greetings cards and did primary research into their current styles and trends. I conducted interviews with other people who've experienced grief, and I also contacted several large greetings card companies with a view to discussing their history, current sales, and future design plans in this area. In terms of practitioners, the primary focus of this essay was on ephemeral materials often designed by unknown designers. I would have liked to have had more time and scope to expand the essay to consider more designed, thoughtful approaches to grief, like those created by artists and writers outside the specific industry of mainstream grieving materials. I enjoyed reading some of Ivor Williams' writings around the ways in which we die and grieve, though none of them quite fitted into the final essay. I was unsurprised to discover that not everyone I interviewed shared my own personal experience, although many of them had feelings on the subject which were very relatable and very useful to furthering ongoing research. Timings-wise, I wish I'd begun some aspects of my primary research earlier in the process, though the reason I didn't do this was because I wanted to clearly be able to proclaim my goals to participants, so it's a bit of a catch-22. My visual essay takes the form of an A5 booklet because I felt that this medium was best for telling a story of sorts. It also reflects the fact that most of my research focused on printed materials, including greetings cards and orders of service, which are often of around this size and style. I wanted my visual essay to feel in keeping with the materials it was focusing on. For further research, I would like more time to liaise with the greetings card companies, as I haven't yet had thorough responses from any of them, although I do have reason to believe I'll hear back. I would be interested to hear more about the subject from their perspective. I would also like to do further research around the implications of class and history on people's choices and preference in this area, as well as potentially expanding my focus beyond greetings cards. I will also say very briefly, you'll have seen there was a little epilogue slide. I produced a short comic and some illustration work and a kind of vague proposal for a project in relation to this, which unfortunately pushed me over my time limit for the reading of this essay. It's actually one of my favourite bits of the whole thing, but I went over, so I don't get to include it. But I just wanted you to know that it's there, and I hope that at some point, maybe when this is being, I don't know if this gets marked more thoroughly, you might get to see the printed piece. It's the stock, the paper stock. It's really nice, really, really lovely. So I hope at some point that you can enjoy that. Thank you for listening.